Kia ora! Hello! This week we're going to look at the construction and evolution of a late 14th century masculine gown. We'll be looking at the techniques to construct the gown and some of the evolution of fashion through the 14th century and into the 15th century. In this video, we'll first be taking a look at the evolution of masculine gowns so we can have a bit of context because, as you know, context is king. And then we will look at our garment, how it compares to an extant example, and the techniques we use to reconstruct it. We won't talk too much about other masculine clothing during this period. However, because fashion is intertwined, there is a little bit of overlapping discussion. As usual, all of our links and sources are below. I'm Ocean, and this is Populaurbanum, a show where we discuss reenactment and the medieval middle class. The gown is a garment that's seen throughout the medieval period as both a masculine and a feminine style. Its style, shape and construction changes throughout the ages and according to who was wearing it. We made a gown intended to be worn as part of a merchant impression, drawing upon several sources, primarily two garments found in Greenland, N63 and N64, museum numbers D10594 and 10595 respectively. Each gown has 8 panels through the body, and each of those panels flares out from the top of the gown towards the hem. D10594, N63, is the shorter garment and of a larger size, while D10595, or N64, is the longer garment and smaller in size. It has therefore been suggested that N63 may have been a man's garment, while N64 may have been a women's garment. N63 is the garment that we will mostly be concentrating on for this video, but many of the features of this garment are shared with N64. This garment style is a departure from the previous short, fitted styles that were fashionable in the mid-14th century and continuing through and peaking at around the 1370s and even the early 1380s, if contemporary artwork is to be relied on. Those short fitted coats and coat hardies from the mid-century didn't disappear, but continued in use for some people through to the end of the 14th century, seeming to coexist with the longer, loose styles. Around the beginning of the 1380s, the fashionable silhouette seems to have started to become more voluminous and once again included long hemlines, most fashionable hemlines having previously been quite short for a few decades around the middle of the 14th century. Was this to accommodate the growing waistlines of the ageing but still fashionable wealthy burghers and nobility? It's easy to see from contemporary artwork that these gowns are different in construction from the T-shaped tunic with side gores, which was the default shaping for masculine gowns or tunics throughout the earlier Middle Ages. These longer, loose styles seem to have gained popularity in the early 1380s, enduring into the 15th century, paving the way for the exaggerated houppelande, which was fashionable for some time around the end of the 14th century and the beginning of the 15th century. Although examples of this style can be found as early as 1369, it seems as if it didn't become truly ubiquitous until the 1380s. We see a number of different images showing this gown style in the late 14th century. The similarity of the cut and drape of the Greenland gowns, N63 and 64, is striking. The type of person wearing this kind of garment would have been varied. Persons such as merchants, workers, farmers, especially those who could afford a better cut and fabric, older men, nobility, and so on. It was a silhouette that transcended the different strata of society. Status and wealth would be conveyed through volume and quality of fabric and cut and finishings. The garment N63 from Greenland is described as having once been a magnificent garment made from fine fabric. This style also existed along with other styles of masculine gowns, such as the cutted slops, which was a really short tight vest or paltock worn with a handsaline over the top, which was a short loose gown cut so short that the underwear could be seen. Scandal! In artwork from the 1380s across Europe, we see young nobles and fighting men in those tight cotehardies and the handsalines, and then we see kings and dignitaries dressed in full-length loose gowns with or without cloaks, and almost everyone else in the style we are examining today. The previous ancient T-shaped tunic would still have been worn by some people, of course, but this flared gown shape seems to have continued in use for decades, largely unchanged. Now for our reconstruction, we used the pattern from one of our favourite websites, Marc Carlson's Some Clothing of the Middle Ages. Link in description. We simply sized the pattern from the website to the body measurements. This was partly done with the assistance of a printer and a photocopier to save time. Our reenactment concentrates on the late 14th century in the Low Countries in mainland Europe, not Greenland, so different fabrication and finishing than the original was thought to be appropriate. We reenact in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where although the climate is generally cool, most reenactment events take place during the warmer months. Andrew therefore chose a lightweight brushed wool flannel in a grey colour, similar in appearance to a natural undyed grey wool. It's not the same as the rich and heavy broadcloths so famous in the Low Countries at the end of the 14th century, but there is evidence to suggest that this kind of lighter weight cloth was also in use at the same time for making garments to be worn in those warmer months. It's also not the same as the fabrics used in construction of the Greenland examples, which are twill-woven woolens of varying sorts. The original colour of the main fabric of N63 was dyed a brownish black. We used grey linen sewing thread to hand stitch the gown together and to hand sew the fabric buttons for the centre front and sleeves. A facing in greenish grey linen was added to the cuffs to reinforce the buttonholes. We tried to follow the techniques used in London around the late 14th century, as we've not yet found much information about the finishing techniques used in the Low Countries for that era. Samples from other locations, even as far removed as Tartu, Estonia, suggest that similar finishing techniques may have been used across Europe, despite the small regional differences in styling. There was also a great deal of textile trade between London and Dutch cities. Therefore, we felt that it might be a more sensible choice to use London finishing techniques for the garment, rather than choosing the very peculiar finishing techniques of the isolated Greenland settlements. Our placement of buttons was quite different to the original and followed the preference of the wearer. We used 10 buttons on the centre front opening and 2 buttons on each sleeve cuff. The centre front buttons were placed in pairs. Now this is because of wanting to make only a few buttonholes and buttons at the time, with the intention to add more in the future to give full coverage along the centre front. The original medieval garments have a button centre front opening with buttons placed in groupings along it as well. The largest number of buttons was on the chest and smaller groupings of buttons were further down. On gown N63 there was 1 button on the stand-up or rink collar, 15 buttons on the front, spaced around 1.8 centimetres apart. There are 3 buttonholes, 14 to 18 centimetres from the bottom edge, but Paul Norland suggests there are no buttons from the waist down. Each buttonhole is approximately 15 millimetres long and there is a total of 19 buttonholes. As noted by Elsa Ostergaard in Woven into the Earth, this style appears in the painting in the chapel of San Giorgio in Padua by Altichiero in 1385. Ostergaard compares N63 to the gown worn by the child at the left-hand side of the image, but it's likely that the garment reached to the knees of the wearer and therefore may have looked more like the pink gown worn by the bearded person on the right-hand side of the image. The original collar was cut from one layer of fabric, a thick vadmal, and was at least 2.7 centimeters high. N63 had an edging, border or trimming on the front edge and neck, stated as being of a madder red, lighter, thinner material. Whether this was a facing strip of fabric such as linen or a lighter wool or a line of tablet weaving or foot weaving or some other form of edge finishing, it was not able to be established from the available resources at this time. Using a single layer of fabric, as they did on the collar, would necessitate some sort of edge finishing. For our reconstruction, we chose to use 2 layers of fabric since the flannel was quite thin and we wanted the collar to stand up on its own. It was constructed in a modern way, bagged out and stab stitched around the edge. This is another concession as the project was completed in the absence of any reference books and using only Marc Carlson's website to refer to. The height of the collar at the centre back was increased to approximately 5 centimeters just to provide coverage for a tattoo. The collar shaping was also customized slightly to fit the wearer. The original sleeves, as we can see, were cut from several panels and pieced together. These included gauze both at the elbows and at the shoulders. Since all the panels seem to have been cut on the same grain and because we wanted to economize on time, we decided to omit all the panels in the sleeves except for the very characteristic shoulder gore. This feature is really helpful in maximizing movement of the arm, and it's too much of a distinctive feature of 14th century garments to be omitted in our opinion. We generally see fuller sleeves on masculine gowns of the last part of the 14th century and the first part of the 15th century, with bag sleeves evolving around the 1380s. They seem to have then continued to grow in size as the 15th century drew nearer, so that an excess of wealth could be expressed through an excess of cloth. Whatever the case, the Greenland gowns seem to include a small bag in the sleeve around the elbow. In the making of our reproduction, placement of the sleeves in the arm size was draped on the body, as we had no documentary evidence to guide us. This eventually proved to be very similar to the original garment, which may have set the sleeve gauze approximately 8 centimeters back from the shoulder seams. Ours sit at approximately 10 centimeters. The current placement of the original garment's shoulder gauze, level with the shoulder seams exactly, was done during a restoration in the 1980s and is agreed by academics to be incorrect. So, there is my short examination of, and our attempt at a reconstruction of, the late medieval masculine flared gown, exemplified by Greenland gowns N63 and N64 and seen in artwork of the period. I hope this video has been of some help to people who want to make or examine the fashion of this period of time. Please check out our sources in the description and feel free to share your experience, knowledge and critique in the comments. Oh hey, I didn't see you there. I guess this means you must have enjoyed the video, so have fun, stay safe and keep reenacting.